There is a mansion in Surrey with 120 rooms, a private lake, and 51 acres of land that would cost you £30 million on the open market. And the man who lives there pays rent of exactly one peppercorn. Not one peppercorn a month, not one peppercorn a year. One peppercorn, full stop, for the rest of the lease. That man is Prince Edward, the king's youngest brother. And the story of how he got that deal, and the decades-long wait for the title that came with it, is stranger, slower, and far more revealing than anything you've read in a headline. Because this isn't really a story about a house. It's a story about a promise made 24 years before it was kept. It's a story about a title that technically belonged to a dead man for months. And it's a story about the one question the royal family never once asked out loud. Who actually gets to decide what a prince is owed? Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand something most royal reporters gloss over: the difference between what Edward was promised, what he actually inherited, and what the public is now demanding to know about how he pays for it. Let's go back to where this really begins. Not in 2023 when the title finally landed, not even in 2007 when the real estate deal was quietly rewritten. We're going back to 1999, to a wedding. When Prince Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones in June of 1999, the palace made an announcement that barely registered outside royal circles at the time. Edward wouldn't become a duke like his brothers. He'd be the Earl of Wessex instead, a noticeably smaller title for the Queen's youngest son. But tucked inside that announcement was a second promise, one that wouldn't matter for years. Buckingham Palace confirmed that Edward would eventually inherit his father's title, Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip's own dukedom, the one he'd held since marrying Elizabeth in 1947. But here's where things get strange. That title wasn't just going to be handed over. Because of how British peerages work, a title held by the monarch's spouse doesn't simply transfer to a younger son. When Philip died, his dukedom of Edinburgh wouldn't pass to Edward directly at all. It would do something called merging in the crown, meaning it would technically belong to Charles, the new king, the moment he took the throne. Only after that could Charles, as monarch, choose to recreate the title and grant it to his brother. In other words, Edward's inheritance wasn't really an inheritance in the normal sense. It was a gift that depended entirely on his older brother's goodwill, decades in the future, with no legal guarantee attached. Think about what that meant for the next 20-plus years. Every time Philip's health made headlines, every time the tabloids speculated about the future of the monarchy, there was Edward's name attached to a title he couldn't actually claim, waiting on outcomes he had zero control over. Royal watchers even reported tensions simmering beneath the surface. Sources cited in royal magazines suggested that while Charles had once reluctantly agreed to eventually hand his brother the dukedom, he wasn't especially thrilled about giving away a title that would carry a lot of weight once his own reign began. Whether that tension was real palace friction or just the kind of thing anonymous sources always seem to say, we can't fully verify. But it captures the uncertainty that hung over this entire arrangement for 2 decades. And that uncertainty didn't end when Philip died in April 2021. If anything, it got worse. Because here's the part almost nobody explains properly. For nearly 2 years after Prince Philip's death, the title Duke of Edinburgh didn't belong to anyone. It sat inside the crown unclaimed, waiting on King Charles to decide when or even if he'd formally recreate it. Edward had been promised the title as far back as 1999. He'd spent decades as the loyal, low-key royal, taking on his father's causes, keeping the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme alive, showing up to the unglamorous engagements nobody else wanted. And still, for 2 full years, the title everyone assumed was his legally belonged to no one at all. Then came March 10th, 2023. Edward's 59th birthday. Buckingham Palace finally announced it. The king had decided to grant his brother the title of Duke of Edinburgh. Formal letters patent followed weeks later, on the 3rd of April, officially advancing Prince Edward Anthony Richard Louis, Earl of Wessex and Forfar, to the state, degree, style, dignity, title, and honor of Duke of Edinburgh. But even this moment, the one that should have been simple, celebratory, and uncomplicated, came with a catch buried in the legal language. This wasn't a hereditary title.
It was granted for Edward's life only. That means when Edward eventually dies, the dukedom of Edinburgh doesn't automatically pass down to his son James. It goes right back into the crown, exactly like it did after Philip's death, waiting once again on a future monarch's decision.
And that's when everything got even more complicated, because that same announcement quietly restructured the next generation too. James, who'd been known since childhood as Viscount Severn, was suddenly restyled as James, Earl of Wessex. His sister Louise's title stayed the same. To most viewers, this looked like a minor technicality. To royal historians, it looked like something else entirely. A deliberate departure from the rules laid out in a 1917 letters patent that had governed royal titles for over a century. Legal commentators pointed out that, strictly speaking, the monarch cannot strip an existing peerage from a family member without formally revoking it. What Charles did instead was more subtle, restricting how a style is used without technically undoing what had already been granted. It's the kind of quiet maneuvering that tells you everything about how modern monarchy actually manages its family disputes, not through public confrontation, but through the wording of documents almost nobody reads. So by 2023, Edward finally had his father's title, 24 years after it was first promised, nearly 2 years after his father died and the title itself briefly ceased to exist in anyone's hands. That's not exactly the stuff of instant inheritance. That's a masterclass in how slowly and how conditionally even a king's own brother receives what he's been told is his. But the title was only ever half the story, because while the world was watching the dukedom, a much bigger and far more financially loaded inheritance question was unfolding quietly, out of the spotlight, over a house. Let's talk about Bagshot Park. In 1996, the Ministry of Defense handed this 120-room Victorian mansion back to the Crown Estate. It had been built in the 1870s for Queen Victoria's son, later used as a military staff college. There's even an old story about King George VI putting up a sign near the lake that read, "Please do not walk on the water." By 1998, the property had a new tenant. Prince Edward signed a 50-year lease. His starting rent? £5,000 a year. Less than $420 a month for one of the grandest private residences in Surrey. But here's where things get strange again. That rent wasn't fixed. As Edward poured money into renovating the estate, reportedly around £1.36 million of his own, with the Crown Estate contributing a further £3 million, his annual rent climbed to around £90,000. Auditors at the time actually described that revised figure as reflecting market value. So far, this sounds almost reasonable. A royal paying to fix up a crumbling estate, and paying rent that roughly tracks what it was worth. Then, in 2007, everything changed. Edward, through a company called Eclipse Nominees Limited, renegotiated the entire arrangement. He paid £5 million up front. In exchange, his lease was extended from its original 50 years all the way out to 150 years. And critically, after that lump sum was paid, his ongoing rent dropped to what's known in property law as a peppercorn, a purely symbolic, nominal amount, sometimes literally described as one peppercorn, included only to make the contract legally binding. Reports on the lease describe it as coming with no other conditions attached. Think about the math here. A 120-room mansion, 51 acres, a private lake, valued today at somewhere around £30 million, and the ongoing cost of living there, according to multiple investigations, is effectively nothing. Now, on its own, this might have stayed a minor footnote in royal finance reporting, the kind of arrangement insiders quietly knew about but the public never really scrutinized. But then, in late 2025, a name from a very different corner of the royal family blew this entire topic wide open: Prince Andrew. When the details of Andrew's own peppercorn rent deal at Royal Lodge became public, a 75-year lease he'd prepaid £8.5 million for, it triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny the palace had spent years avoiding. Suddenly, journalists started asking a very obvious follow-up question. If Andrew's arrangement was this generous, who else in the family has a similar deal? And that's when Bagshot Park came roaring back into the headlines. Investigative reporting from major outlets confirmed what royal watches had long suspected but rarely discussed publicly. Edward's peppercorn arrangement wasn't some isolated curiosity. It was part of a wider pattern across multiple royal properties, all managed through the Crown estate, all largely shielded from public disclosure. By law, 100% of the Crown estate's net profits are supposed to go straight to the Treasury. Every property leased below market value, critics argued, is effectively money redirected away from public services and into royal pockets. The response from Parliament was immediate. The Public Accounts Committee launched a formal inquiry into royal property financing, specifically demanding that the Crown estate disclose the actual terms under which family members occupy these residences. This wasn't a tabloid rumor anymore. This was a parliamentary committee on the record asking the Crown estate to explain itself. But what happened next shocked even people who'd been following this story closely. It emerged that Edward and Sophie hadn't just been quietly enjoying a discounted mansion. They'd apparently been generating income from it. Reports surfaced that the couple had been subletting a converted stable block on the Bagshot Park estate, reportedly earning somewhere in the region of £130,000 a year from the arrangement, with the proceeds going to the couple rather than back into public coffers. To be clear, there's no suggestion whatsoever that this was illegal. Subletting isn't against the rules, but the optics were brutal. Here was a member of the family paying essentially nothing in rent on a property owned by the public, turning around and profiting from renting out part of that same property to someone else.
You can imagine how that detail landed with a Public Accounts Committee already circling. Let's step back for a second, because it's worth putting these two stories side by side. On one hand, you have Edward's dukedom, a title he was promised in 1999 that spent nearly 2 years in legal limbo after his father's death, that he finally received in 2023, but only as a life peerage that dies with him and reverts to the crown once more. On the other hand, you have Bagshot Park, a property he's occupied since 1998, locked into a 150-year lease at essentially zero ongoing cost, now under direct parliamentary scrutiny as part of a wider reckoning over how the monarchy funds itself. Two very different kinds of inheritance, one symbolic, slow-moving, and tightly controlled by the sovereign's discretion, the other financial, decades long, and only now facing the kind of transparency that most ordinary landlord-tenant relationships have been subject to for years. And that's the pattern that runs through almost everything about how modern royal inheritance actually works. It isn't like a normal family passing down a house or a family name. Nearly everything a working royal holds, their title, their residence, their public role, exists at the pleasure of whoever currently sits on the throne, wrapped in centuries-old legal mechanisms most people have never heard of, like a title merging in the crown, or a lease structured through a private company, or a peerage granted for life rather than passed down. It raises a question that goes well beyond Edward specifically. If even a king's own brother has to wait 24 years for a promised title and receives it only as a temporary non-hereditary grant, what does that tell us about how much real security any modern royal actually has? The crown, it turns out, doesn't really believe in permanent inheritance at all. It believes in conditional privilege, renewed generation by generation, entirely at the discretion of whoever happens to be wearing it. That tension is exactly why the Public Accounts Committee inquiry matters so much right now. Because for the first time in years, Parliament isn't just asking the palace to be transparent about who holds which title. It's demanding to know the actual pound and pence terms behind arrangements like Bagshot Park. Arrangements that have operated quietly, some of them for nearly 3 decades, largely outside public view. As of now, the outcome of that inquiry is still unfolding. The Crown Estate hasn't been forced to release every detail of every royal lease. Edward and Sophie haven't publicly responded in depth to the subletting revelations. And the broader question, whether the monarchy's property arrangements will finally be brought in line with the kind of transparency expected of any other publicly accountable institution, remains genuinely open.
What we can say for certain is this. The story of Edward's inheritance was never really about a single dramatic legal confirmation, no matter how many headlines have tried to frame it that way. It's a story that unfolded over 27 years, from a wedding announcement in 1999 to a renegotiated lease in 2007 to a title finally granted in 2023, to a parliamentary inquiry still playing out today. It's slower, messier, and honestly more interesting than any single shocking twist could capture, because it shows you something the palace would probably rather you didn't think about too hard, that even at the very top of Britain's oldest institution, nothing is guaranteed, nothing is simple, and almost nothing happens without decades of quiet, careful, deliberate control. So the next time you see a headline claiming some dramatic legal bombshell just dropped inside the royal family, ask yourself the question this story should leave you with. Is this actually new information, or is it just the latest chapter in an arrangement that's been unfolding, in plain sight, for a very long time? If you want to understand how the rest of the monarchy's property and title arrangements actually work, the ones involving Prince Andrew or Prince William's new lease at Forest Lodge, that's a story just as tangled as this one, and it might change how you see the whole institution. Let me know in the comments which royal financial arrangement you want broken down next.